At 700 on a winter morning in 1945, the forest was frozen solid. Snow lay unbroken across the ground, hard enough to carry the weight of men, soft enough to swallow sound. The American front line was silent. No engines, no voices, only breath steaming in the dark, and the faint creak of frozen trees bending in the wind. Then, the first German shells arrived. They did not come all at once. One explosion, a pause, another, then a pattern. Artillery walked forward through the trees, each blast closer than the last. Trunks shattered. Frozen earth erupted into the air. Snow turned gray, then black. Men pressed themselves deeper into foxholes as shockwaves rolled through the ground and up their bones. The barrage lasted 12 minutes, long enough for fear to settle in. Long enough for everyone to understand this was not harassment fire. This was preparation. And then it stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. No birds, no wind, no movement. Just the smell of burned wood and explosives hanging in the cold air. The kind of silence soldiers learn to fear more than noise. From somewhere beyond the tree line came a low mechanical rumble. Not loud, steady, deliberate. Tank engines. One after another, synchronized, moving forward at walking speed. German armor was advancing. Behind them, 600 infantry were already moving through the forest, using the shattered trees for cover, closing the distance toward the American line. The men in the foxholes could not see them yet. They did not need to. Everyone on that frozen front understood what came next. There were no American tanks waiting, no tank destroyers hidden in reserve, no reinforced line behind them. If the German armor broke through, the battalion would be crushed in minutes. Once tanks reached the foxholes, there would be no retreat, only panic and collapse. Inside a small command post behind the line, a single lieutenant studied a map under flickering light. He was not an infantry platoon leader. He was not assigned to the front. His job was information, reports, interrogations, marking enemy movements with pencil lines and symbols. But maps could not stop tanks. The forward observation post was gone, destroyed in the opening barrage. The men who should have been watching the German approach were dead or wounded. No one could see the advance. No one could direct artillery fire. Without eyes forward, the guns behind the line were blind. The lieutenant listened to the engines growing louder. He knew what would happen when the tanks reached the open ground. He knew how quickly a battalion could disappear. And in that moment, standing in the cold with artillery falling closer and armor moving in, he made a decision no one had ordered him to make. A decision that would either stop the attack or erase him from the battlefield entirely. The question was no longer whether the Germans were coming. It was whether one man could step forward and stop them before it collapsed. The battlefield Connor was standing on that morning was known as the Kmar Pocket, the last major German-held enclave still resisting Allied forces inside France in January 1945. It covered roughly 850 square miles of frozen forest, villages, and open farmland west of the Rhine River. Every attempt to eliminate it since November had failed. Thousands of French and American soldiers had been killed trying to push the Germans back across the river, and winter had locked both sides into exhaustion. Temperatures averaged 10 degrees below zero. Snow never fully melted. It hardened, cracked under boots, then swallowed sound again. Men slept in frozen foxholes when they could sleep at all. Many did not. Frostbite cases were constant. Rifles jammed. Radios failed. Every movement required more effort than it should have, and every mistake was punished immediately. The German 19th Army understood the situation perfectly. They were trapped, running low on supplies, and out of time. Operation Nordwind, launched on New Year's Day, was Germany's last offensive in the West. While the Battle of the Bulge still raged to the north, the Germans in the Kamar pocket were ordered to break through American lines in Alsace and force the Allies to divert troops. If they failed, the pocket would be erased. For this counterattack, the Germans massed approximately 600 infantry and 6 Tiger tanks. The Tigers were the centerpiece, 60 tons each. 88mm guns capable of destroying any American position at point-blank range. Heavy frontal armor that standard artillery struggled to stop. Behind them marched experienced infantry, advancing in coordinated rushes, covering one another with disciplined fire. The American 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, was in no position to meet that force. They had been on the line for 18 straight days. They had already lost 43 men, most to artillery and snipers. There were no American tanks supporting them, no tank destroyers hidden nearby, no forward anti-armor guns positioned along the line. If the German Tigers reached the foxholes, the battalion would be overrun. Artillery was the only weapon capable of stopping the attack. American 105mm howitzers sat 3 miles behind the line, powerful enough to shatter infantry formations and disrupt armor. But artillery without observation was useless. Shells fired blind wasted ammunition and time was something 3rd Battalion did not have. The forward observation post that should have directed the guns had been destroyed in the opening German barrage. The observers were dead or wounded. Trees blocked the view from the command post. No one could see the German advance. No one could adjust fire. The artillery existed, but it was blind. If the Tigers broke through, panic would follow. Retreating soldiers would be cut down. The Germans would push deeper into the sector. The entire front could collapse under pressure that winter-worn units could not absorb. This was not a battle that could be lost and corrected later. This was a line that had to hold, or everything behind it would fall. And standing inside that fragile command post was a single lieutenant, watching a map that suddenly meant nothing at all. He was not supposed to be there. First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor was an intelligence officer assigned to 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, not a frontline commander and not a forward observer. His job was to gather reports, interrogate prisoners, analyze patrol findings, and mark enemy positions on maps. Intelligence officers stayed behind the line. They worked with paper, not rifles. Connor did not fit the image of a battlefield hero. He was 25 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and weighed barely 120 pounds. He came from Clinton County, Kentucky, a tobacco farm miles from the nearest high school. He never finished his education because getting to class meant a 15-mile walk each way. When he enlisted in March 1941, he was not chasing glory. He was looking for steady work and a way out of poverty. 4 years later, he had fought through 10 major campaigns. He had taken part in 4 amphibious landings. He had been wounded 7 times. Each wound sent him to a hospital bed. Each time, he returned to the front as soon as he was cleared. 3 weeks before the morning at the Kamar pocket, Connor had been evacuated again, injured badly enough that doctors expected him to stay behind the lines. He returned to his battalion 2 days before the German attack. His official role placed him in the command post, not in a foxhole. But Connor had a reputation within 3rd Battalion. When fighting became desperate, he moved forward. He had already earned 4 silver stars for actions that were not part of his assigned duties. in Italy in October 1943, at Anzio in January 1944, in France in September 1944, each award followed the same pattern: a breakdown, a gap, no one stepping forward, Connor stepping forward anyway. He was not reckless. He did not rush blindly into danger. He simply refused to stay still when other soldiers were about to die, and he believed he could change the outcome. He understood terrain. He understood timing. He understood artillery. More importantly, he understood responsibility. On the morning of January 24th, 1945, Connor stood inside the battalion command post, listening to German artillery tear apart the forest ahead. He knew the forward observers were gone. He knew the Tigers were coming. He knew the battalion had no armor and no second line. And he knew that his position, his rank, and his job description did not matter anymore. Connor did not think of himself as extraordinary. He did not speak about courage. He did not speak about sacrifice. Later in life, when asked about moments like this, he would say only that someone had to act. That morning, as the map blurred into irrelevance and the engines grew louder, First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor understood that someone was him. He had seen what hesitation cost in earlier battles. Minutes lost meant platoons erased. Indecision meant wounded men bleeding alone in snow. Connor had learned that war did not reward perfect plans, only timely decisions. Standing there, hearing the approach, he accepted what that lesson demanded, even if it meant stepping into a role no one had given him, and surviving was no longer guaranteed. The moment was closing fast around him. When the German barrage lifted, the command post filled with the sound of engines and runners. Reports arrived half-finished, shouted through smoke and snow. The forward observation post was gone. The men who should have been watching the German advance were dead or wounded. No one could see beyond the tree line. No one could direct artillery fire. First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor spread the map across the table. Pencil marks showed American foxholes, likely German routes, the narrow strip of open ground separating them. The Tigers were coming through the woods, masked by trees, invisible to the guns 3 miles behind the line. Without a forward observer, the artillery was useless. Blind fire would waste minutes the battalion did not have. Connor looked at the battalion commander. There was no order to give. The situation was already clear. If the tanks reached the foxholes, the battalion would collapse. If the artillery could not be directed, nothing could stop them. The decision forming in Connor's mind was simple, but irreversible. He picked up a field telephone and a spool of wire. 400 yards of it. Enough to reach the front line. Enough to reach death if the Germans were watching. Connor did not announce what he was about to do. He did not ask permission. He simply stepped out of the command post and into the snow. The air was still for a moment. Then, the first shells returned. Not random fire, but deliberate. German guns opening again, preparing the way for armor. Connor began to run. Snow broke beneath his boots. The wire unspooled behind him, dragging, snagging, then sliding free again. He carried the telephone in one hand and the spool in the other, leaning forward, moving as fast as his legs would allow. He crossed open ground that offered no cover and no concealment. Trees exploded nearby. Shockwaves punched his chest and legs. Frozen dirt rained down, stinging his face. He did not slow. Stopping meant dying in the open. Running at least offered a chance. Halfway across, shells began to bracket him. One fell close behind, then another closer ahead. The Germans had observers. They could see a lone American moving toward their attack. Connor kept running, breath burning his lungs, boots slipping on ice hidden beneath the snow. He reached the American foxholes without stopping. Soldiers stared as he passed, an intelligence officer running forward instead of back. Connor did not look at them. He kept moving another 30 yards beyond the line toward the Germans. There he found what he needed, a shallow ditch no more than 18 inches deep. Not protection, not safety, just enough depression in the ground to lower his silhouette. Connor dropped into it and pulled the telephone close. The wire had held. He cranked the handset. Static. Then a voice. The Artillery Fire Direction Center answered. Connor gave his position calmly. He reported enemy movement. He was now the eyes of the guns. Lying in that shallow ditch, ahead of the American line, Connor understood there was no way back that did not involve success. If he failed, he would die alone in the snow, and the battalion would follow. He also understood something else. Once the first shell was fired on his command, the battle would belong to time, not intention. Every adjustment would pull danger closer. Every correction would narrow the distance between survival and obliteration. From that ditch forward, there would be no retreat, no relief, no replacement. Only a voice on a wire, a frozen body pressed into the earth, and a single chance to stop 6 tanks and 600 men before they erased everything behind him. The decision had already been made, and the consequences were now advancing through the trees, measured in seconds. There would be no second chance. Not for him. Not for them. Not today. Not here. Ever. The first American shells arrived 40 seconds after Connor finished giving his coordinates. He counted the seconds silently, his body pressed into the frozen earth, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. When the sky finally tore open, 12 105mm shells slammed into the forest 150 yards behind the advancing German infantry. The explosions were violent, but wrong. Too far. The Germans barely reacted. Artillery landing behind an advance meant guesswork, and the men kept moving. Connor grabbed the handset. "Drop 100! Fire for effect!" 18 seconds later, the second salvo struck. This time, the shells landed in the middle of the German formations. Trees disintegrated. Shrapnel ripped through branches and bodies alike. Entire squads vanished in bursts of flame and splintered wood. The advance stopped abruptly, momentum broken in an instant. Soldiers dropped, scattered, crawled for cover. Connor watched every movement, every hesitation, every attempt to regroup. The guns behind the line were firing blind no longer. Through a single wire and a steady voice, Connor had turned chaos into clarity. "Repeat fire, same coordinates." Another salvo followed, then another. The American howitzers were now firing at maximum rate, 4 rounds per minute per gun. 48 shells every 60 seconds hammered the same stretch of forest. German infantry formations dissolved. Command and control vanished. What had been a coordinated attack became isolated men trying to survive. But the Tigers kept coming. Connor could see them now, massive shapes pushing through shattered trees, 60-ton machines advancing methodically, unhurried, untouched by the destruction around them. Artillery could kill men easily. Tanks were different. Tracks could break. Optics could shatter. Crews could panic. But armor rarely failed cleanly. The Tigers moved in a wedge formation, 2 in front, 2 behind, 2 trailing. Their commanders scanned the American line, searching for targets. One of the tanks fired. The 88mm gun cracked through the air. An American foxhole disappeared in a column of dirt and snow. The men inside were gone. Connor shifted his fire. Enemy armor advancing. 250 meters. Shells began falling around the tanks. Too wide. Too safe. The Tigers drove through the explosions without slowing. Their commanders knew the shells could not reliably penetrate. They intended to push through and finish the fight at point-blank range. Connor faced the decision he had known would come. Safe fire would fail. Dangerous fire might work. Drop 50. Fire for effect. The next salvo landed closer. One shell struck the lead Tiger's right track. Metal snapped. The tank slewed sideways and stopped, immobilized, but still lethal. Another shell hit the engine deck of a second Tiger. Smoke poured from the rear. The crew hesitated, unsure whether to abandon it or fight on. 4 Tigers continued forward. Connor adjusted again. Each correction pulled the explosions closer to his own position. The concussion waves battered his body. Frozen dirt rained into the ditch. His ears rang. He could barely hear the voice on the other end of the line, but the connection held. The Tigers began to change direction. Their commanders had seen the wire. They knew someone ahead of the American line was directing the fire, and they were coming toward him. Connor did not move. He could not. His value was not his rifle or his body. It was his sight and his voice. He continued to call adjustments, walking the shells closer, forcing the tanks to slow, forcing their crews to close hatches, forcing hesitation into machines built to advance without it. Every adjustment reduced the margin for survival. Every order tightened the circle around his ditch. Connor understood the math clearly. If he stayed too safe, the battalion would die. If he pushed too close, he might die instead. He chose to keep pushing. By controlling what the guns could see, he was controlling the battle itself, second by second, shell by shell, trading distance for time and time for lives. The distance was collapsing. The German Tigers had pushed through the shattered tree line and into open ground, their engines steady, their advance deliberate. Connor could see all 6 now. 60 tons of steel each, spreading out, adapting, learning. Behind them, German infantry regrouped, using the tanks as moving walls of armor, advancing only when the Tigers advanced, stopping when they stopped. The artillery had devastated the infantry earlier, but it had not ended the attack. The survivors were veterans. They crawled through shell craters, pressed close to the tanks, stayed inside the shadows of steel. Connor watched them reform, watched discipline replace panic. The battle was not over. It was tightening. The Tigers were inside 300 yards. One fired again. An American foxhole vanished. Snow and earth exploded upward, then settled back down. Empty. The battalion could not endure this much longer. Connor knew the math. Minutes, not hours. He adjusted fire again, dropping shells directly in front of the advancing tanks. Explosions hammered the ground. Shock waves rolled through his body. The Tigers slowed, but did not stop. Their commanders had closed their hatches now. They would drive through anything that did not kill them outright. The infantry followed closely, protected by armor. If Connor pulled the fire back, they would surge forward. If he held it where it was, the Tigers would push through. There was no safe solution left. The tanks closed to 200 yards, then 150. Connor could see markings on their turrets, faces inside open hatches before they slammed shut again. The battle had narrowed to a strip of ground no wider than a football field, and Connor was lying at the front edge of it. 18 inches of frozen earth between him and annihilation. German infantry were now close enough that he could hear shouted commands. He could hear the crunch of boots in snow, the metallic click of rifle bolts. They were no longer afraid of the artillery. They understood its limits. Connor pressed the handset tighter to his ear. His hands were numb. His breath came shallow. He did not look back toward the American line. He did not need to. He already knew what would happen if he failed. If he withdrew, the guns would fire blind. The tigers would roll forward. The foxholes would be crushed. Men would run. They would be hunted down in open snow. The line would break, and everything behind it would pay the price. Connor made the decision without drama. "Fire on my position." The voice on the other end of the line repeated the coordinates. Once, then again. Calling artillery on your own position was not procedure. It meant shells would land inside the danger radius. It meant survival was unlikely. Connor confirmed. The wait began. Seconds stretched. He lay flat, pressed into the frozen earth, mouth open, lungs tight. The air felt heavy, wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then the first shells landed. The ground erupted 30 yards in front of him. The concussion slammed into his body like a physical blow. The air compressed his chest. His vision blurred. Dirt and shrapnel screamed overhead. The sound was not an explosion so much as an overwhelming force, a pressure that erased all other noise. He stayed in the ditch. "Drop 20. Repeat fire." The next salvo landed closer. Heat washed over him. Shrapnel tore through the air just feet above his head. The ditch shook, barely holding together. If the shells landed any closer, there would be nothing left of him to protect. The Tigers stopped. Their engines still ran, but they did not advance. Tank commanders closed hatches completely, sealing themselves inside armor as explosions detonated almost on top of them. Infantry dropped flat, pressed into snow, unable to move forward without stepping into a wall of fire. Connor did not lift his head. He did not look to see the effect. He did not need to. He felt the hesitation through the ground itself. He adjusted again, walking the shells back and forth, keeping the explosions between himself and the enemy. Every order kept the danger close. Every correction was a calculated gamble that his body could endure one more shockwave. The German advance faltered. Then it stalled. Then it stopped. For the first time since the engines had been heard, the Tigers were no longer moving forward. Connor stayed where he was, holding the handset, counting the seconds between salvos, knowing that if he moved now, even for a moment, everything would surge forward again. He had placed himself at the center of the fire, and as long as he remained there, the attack could not continue. This was the line now. A shallow ditch, a telephone wire, and one man who had decided that the ground beneath him was worth more than his own life. When the artillery finally slowed, the battlefield felt unreal. Smoke drifted low through the shattered trees. The thunder that had ruled the morning faded into distant echoes, then into nothing at all. Connor stayed in the ditch, motionless, waiting for sound to return. His ears rang. His chest hurt with every breath. The handset was still pressed to his face, slick with ice and dirt. Minutes passed before he trusted the silence. German engines were no longer advancing. Rifle fire had stopped. The attack was over. Not because the enemy had been destroyed, but because it had been broken. Connor lifted his head slowly and looked across the ground in front of him. The forest was unrecognizable. Trees lay splintered, stripped bare. Shell craters overlapped until the earth looked churned by machinery rather than war. German bodies lay scattered where formations had once moved in order. Some were still, some wounded, calling out in voices that carried weakly through the cold air. Burned equipment lay half-buried in snow. Tracks from disabled Tiger tanks cut deep scars through the frozen ground, ending abruptly where armor had stopped and crews had fled. Behind him, the American line was intact. Foxholes still stood. Men were alive inside them. Connor climbed out of the ditch with difficulty. His legs were stiff, barely responsive. 2 hours pressed into frozen earth had locked his joints. He took a step, then another, moving back toward the line he had not looked at since he left it. The soldiers watched him approach. No one cheered. No one spoke. They stared at the ground he had held, and then at him, as if trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Some nodded. Others simply looked away. They knew what the alternative had been. Connor reached the foxholes and stopped. A medic looked at him and shook his head in disbelief. Dirt and fragments had torn through his uniform. A small piece of shrapnel was embedded near his shoulder, unnoticed until now. The medic wrapped it without ceremony. There were others who needed more urgent care. Reports came in quietly. The Germans had lost at least 50 men confirmed dead, many more wounded, and all 6 Tiger tanks were destroyed or abandoned. American losses after Connor reached the ditch were 0. The battalion had held. Connor did not stay to hear the full accounting. He walked back to the command post slowly, feeling the weight settle into his body now that the danger had passed. Inside, the map still lay on the table. It no longer mattered. The line was still there. He said nothing about what he had done. He did not explain his choices. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He sat down, exhausted, and listened to the wind moving through broken trees outside. The violence had ended, but its cost remained, etched into the frozen ground and into the faces of the men who had watched a single figure hold the line while everything else fell apart. No medals were mentioned that day. No speeches were given. Orders resumed, routine returned, and the war moved on without pause. Yet every man there understood the truth in silence. Survival had been purchased at a terrible distance, measured not in yards, but in willingness. Connor carried that weight quietly as the snow settled again, covering scars, hiding bodies, and leaving the field calm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The quiet afterward felt heavier than any shell, pressing down on memory, ensuring the moment would never truly leave those who survived that frozen winter morning. When Garland Merl Connor left France in March 1945, the war was still raging, but his part in it was over. He sailed from Le Havre on a transport ship and arrived in New York 3 weeks later, thinner, quieter, and carrying wounds that would never fully heal. He was honorably discharged in June, returned to Clinton County, Kentucky, and went back to farming. There were no speeches waiting for him, no permanent honors on display. When neighbors asked about the war, Connor said little. He told them he had left those memories across the Atlantic and had no intention of bringing them home. Connor married Pauline Wells in July 1945. She had heard the stories read aloud during a local ceremony, citations describing actions that sounded impossible. She could not reconcile them with the soft-spoken man she knew. Connor never tried to correct her disbelief. He stored his medals in a cardboard box inside a duffel bag and placed them in a closet. 4 silver stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, Purple Hearts, foreign decorations. They stayed there for decades, untouched, unseen, unmentioned, as Connor built a quiet life raising crops, serving in veterans organizations, and helping other farmers navigate hardship. For more than 50 years, January 24th, 1945 remained unspoken. Even Pauline did not know the details. Connor believed that talking about what he had done would diminish it. He believed courage was a duty, not a story. When asked why he never displayed his medals, he said only that they belonged to the men who had not come home. In 1996, a letter arrived from a veteran named Richard Chilton, researching his uncle who had been killed in Italy. Chilton asked if Connor remembered him. Connor invited him in. As they talked, memories surfaced that Connor had buried for half a century. He described carrying wounded men, staying with them until the end. For the first time in years, he cried. Pauline brought out the duffel bag. Chilton read the citations and understood immediately that something was missing. Connor had never received the Medal of Honor. Chilton began a long process, gathering eyewitness accounts, filing appeals, and pushing the case forward. The Army denied the request twice. Connor died in 1998, still without recognition. Pauline did not stop. She continued collecting testimony from soldiers who had watched him lie in that shallow ditch for hours, calling fire closer and closer. Historians supported the upgrade. Lawmakers endorsed it. Years passed with no answer. In 2015, the Army finally reversed its decision. Congress waived the time limits. On June 26, 2018, Pauline stood in the East Room of the White House as the citation was read aloud. The words described a man who ran forward when no one else could, who called artillery onto his own position, and who saved an entire battalion. Pauline accepted the medal her husband had never sought. Connor's story ends quietly. A farmer, a soldier, a man who did what needed to be done and never spoke of it again. The question remains for those who hear it now. How many others lie hidden in silence, their courage unrecorded, waiting not for praise, but for memory?